My name's John Roney. I'm an archaeologist retired from the Bureau of Land Management. I'm being filmed today on April 14th, 2019 at my home here in Albuquerque. Okay, well I was really interested in archaeology from a very young age. I grew up on a farm and a lot of our family friends were ranchers. People used to give me arrowheads when I was little, and I was always just really fascinated by that. Actually, when I was in high school, I began to excavate a small rock shelter in the Guadalupe Mountains. And after we graduated from high school, or probably while we were still in high school, some of my friends went over to New Mexico Tech and Socorro and met Robert Weber, who was a really well-known and competent avocational archaeologist. And through him we became were introduced to Cynthia Irwin Williams, who is at Eastern New Mexico University. And that's sort of how my archaeological experience began. So when I graduated from high school, I was accepted at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. And initially, was on track to be a scientist of some sort. But while taking my undergraduate courses, really what my real passion was for archaeology. So by the end of my sophomore year, I pretty well decided that that's the career track that I wanted to take. And so I arranged to take my junior year off campus at the University of Arizona so I could take more anthropology. So I arranged that whatever courses I might want to take there would transfer back and count toward graduation at Carleton. So that's what I did. I went to the University of Arizona my junior year, took classes there from Gwen Vivian and Bill Rathje, Longacre, and then came back to Carleton my senior year and completed my undergraduate degree. Yeah, I never really did a field school. We continued this work in the Guadalupe Mountains. Got a permit from the Forest Service to do the work through Eastern New Mexico University. And that eventually became a large part of my master's thesis. So I completed my degree at Carleton College, and that summer then, Gwen Vivian hired me at the Arizona State Museum. And so that was my first paying job in archaeology. And I was really fortunate in that while I was going to school, the National Historic Preservation Act passed. So all of a sudden there was an actual demand for archaeologists. I've always felt really fortunate in that regard. So I worked that first summer for the Arizona State Museum, and then began graduate school at Eastern New Mexico University, working toward a master's degree there. Finished 2 years of studies at Eastern New Mexico University, and then was hired again by the Arizona State Museum that following summer to do field survey. In terms of that initial work in the Guadalupe Mountains, I think I bought a copy of Heiser's book on field methods, and was kind of working from that, pretty much self-taught. And then Cynthia Irwin Williams, when we connected with her, she connected us with Mark Wimberly, who was working at Fresno Shelter. So I went and spent about a week working with them and learning additional things about field methodology there. So that's basically how we learned to do. And of course, she had a lot of advice for us in terms of what we should be doing and what we should do different, what we were doing right, and so forth. Cynthia Irwin Williams she's the main reason that I went to Eastern. She's a major influence on me and many other archaeologists that are active in the Southwest today. Yeah, I was always glad that I went to Eastern because I feel like I had a lot of opportunities there that I wouldn't have had at another school. One of those, I was able to teach some classes, which was kind of fun, and that was good experience. And also, Eastern New Mexico became involved really early on in doing contract work. So while I was going to graduate school, I was able to earn money by doing contract work, and got a lot of really valuable experience that I think helped me get my first career type job. The other thing, through Eastern, Cynthia was just beginning to work at Salmon Ruin up near Farmington, and the Archaeological Society of New Mexico had a field school going at another site near there that was related to the Salmon Ruin. And so I was hired while I was going to graduate school to direct that field school for a season, and that was another really valuable experience for me that I probably wouldn't have had an opportunity to at that stage in my career. In terms of working at the University of Arizona, at the Arizona State Museum, the first job that I had there, which was right after I completed my undergraduate degree, was working on an overview for the Bureau of Land Management, for the San Simon and Vulture units, planning units, the Bureau of Land Management. And then the next year when I went back that was after I'd completed my graduate studies. The project was an archaeological survey for it was alternatives for a large dam that was being constructed in central Arizona, the Orm Alternatives Project. And in both cases, I was really fortunate in working under some really good people that really knew what they were doing, and that I've always been grateful for that as well. So while I was working for the Arizona State Museum on the Orm project, we were in Pumpkin Center, Arizona, I know, and got a message in the field that the Bureau of Land Management was trying to reach me. I had taken the avenue into the civil service at that time was the Professional Administrative Career Examination, the PACE examination, and I had taken that exam, but there really wasn't a way to indicate that I wanted work in archaeology, and I'd had a couple of job offers from them for to be a tax assessor and things like that I really wasn't interested in, and I'd pretty much written that off as a career track. But while we were in the field, I got word that they'd been trying to reach me, the Bureau of Land Management in Nevada, and so anyway, I got back in touch with them, and they were offering me a job in Winnemucca, Nevada, and told me I was being considered for two other district archaeology jobs in Nevada. So I went ahead and accepted that, negotiated an exit date with the Arizona State Museum, and when that project ended, then I moved to Winnemucca, Nevada, and that's where my actual career started. Yeah, so when I moved to Nevada, I don't think I'd ever actually been in Nevada before. I didn't really know what to expect. Winnemucca, of course, is a real small town up in the northwestern part of the state, but it's the largest place for miles around. And I'd grown up in a small town, so that wasn't a really big adjustment. The archaeology program was brand new. I was the first archaeologist there, and initially there was a lot of resistance to it's just another piece of red tape, basically. So that was kind of one of the important things that I think we did, myself and other archaeologists in those early years, was basically to try to gain acceptance for the program, and also just figuring out what we were supposed to do, what the law was, what it required, and how we ought to go about bringing the agency into compliance with the law. When I moved to Winnemucca, I guess that would have been 1975 when I first moved to Winnemucca, and as I mentioned, there was initially some resistance to archaeology there. Bob York was the state office archaeologist, and he was hired before I was, so he was the first archaeologist the BLM hired there in Nevada. And he was real helpful in terms of figuring out what we needed to be doing and what the laws required and so forth. We had to constantly stress that in our interactions with other BLM programs. And we also, I've always been really passionate about archaeology, and I think that's one thing that helps people accept it when they see it's important to someone, that a coworker, and tried to find the parts of it that were interested, that captured people's imagination, and took every opportunity to stress its importance, and in a last resort fell back on the argument that it's the law. So I worked for the Bureau of Land Management for 5 years in Winnemucca, and I really enjoyed my time there. It's a part of the country that, if you drive through it on the interstate, it doesn't really impress you very much. But once you get out into the country there, it's, boy, I'd put it up against any place I've been. It can be really beautiful. When I was there, I did a lot of field work, which has always been a part of archaeology that I've really enjoyed. I lived in a real small apartment there in town, and really thought of my apartment as just another campsite, basically, and tried to spend as much time as I could out in the field looking at things. And I think for my generation of BLM archaeologists, really one of the main contributions that we made and that needed to be made at that point was to inventory the resources that were on public lands, the resources that the agency's responsible for. Because when I was first hired, there was really very, very little information about what sites were out there, what they were like, what aspects needed management, and so forth. I did a lot of field work. That's the part of my time in Winnemucca that I remember the best. Yeah. So then, at that time in the BLM, the BLM was it was kind of an interesting time, because they'd gone through a wave of hiring sometime in the 50s and 60s, I guess, and many of the employees were at retirement age at the time that I was hired. There was also a lawsuit by the National Resource Defense Council, I think, that the government had lost, that said that the Bureau of Land Management had to do more environmental analysis, more environmental impact statements. And so the agency was hiring not just archaeologists, but people in a variety of disciplines. A large number of new employees came on board at about that time, and we began our careers there. So the normal thing in the BLM was to work several years in one location and then move to a different location. So after I'd been in Winnemucca for 2 or 3 years, I began to look around for other jobs and to apply for other archaeology positions in other parts of the West. One of the ones that came up was the position of district archaeologist in the Albuquerque district, which at that time included Farmington and Taos, and basically the northern half of New Mexico. I really thought of it as kind of one of the plums in the BLM, and so I applied for that job and was fortunate to be the one that was selected for it. So in 1980, I think, I moved from Winnemucca, Nevada to Albuquerque, New Mexico, which of course was closer to my original home, and my family had family here, so it was good in that regard. Several things were going on when I first arrived in Albuquerque. One was a coal leasing program in the San Juan Basin, which was a really big deal. And the other was that the Public Law 96-550, the Chaco Archaeological Protection Act, had also just been passed. So I kind of immediately became real heavily involved in those two major processes that were underway. The coal leasing program was probably one of the most interesting. Just before I moved to Albuquerque, I think, was when Ronald Reagan was elected president. And he appointed a Secretary of Interior, James Watt, who was very anti-environmental and very pro-industry, and a major goal of his administration was to transfer resources from the public sector to the private sector. And this coal program was one of the big priorities. He didn't go about it in the way that I think would have been most productive if you wanted to achieve that goal. Essentially, he doubled the leasing target overnight. And the environmental process was already almost complete. And there was no change in the time frame for the deadlines for the leasing. So the Bureau of Land Management was more or less directed to issue a record of decision that included large areas that hadn't been included in the environmental analysis. And myself and other archaeologists who were working for the BLM at the time advised them that wasn't going to pass the muster, that there was no way we could do an adequate analysis in the time that we had left. And sure enough, they went ahead anyway, and the environmental process was challenged in court, and the government lost that case, and they were directed to do a second environmental impact statement, which was practically an unprecedented thing to happen at that time. And there was a lot of fallout. Managers lost their jobs, and some of the archaeologists who'd been involved in it longer than I had also very unfairly were punished for that as well. Another aspect of the whole coal leasing issue that I might talk some about is the Chaco Roads project. When the leasing program was first proposed in its original form, the BLM state office archaeologist, Chris Kincaid, recognized right away that Chacoan roads were going to be a major issue. They were something that was really important. They were really mysterious, kind of captured public imagination, and nobody really knew anything about them. Just very, very little previous work had been done. So as part of the coal leasing, the environmental analysis for the coal leasing program, Chris initiated the Chaco Roads project. And that was beginning just as I came to Albuquerque. And there again, I feel really fortunate to have been involved in that. Worked with people like John Stein and Chris Kincaid and Fred Niles on that project, and just learned a tremendous amount about archaeology and remote sensing and some methodologies that weren't very well understood in archaeology. And so that eventually became one of the academic related accomplishments that I'm proud of. At some point I wrote an article kind of summarizing what my thoughts were on that subject. So the Chaco Roads project sort of interfingered with the Chacoan Archaeological Protection Act. That act had set aside Chacoan outliers, and that was a time when people were just beginning to recognize that Chaco was more than just Chaco Canyon, that there was a much larger phenomenon out there, and identification of the Chacoan outliers was one of the things that was going on at that time. We were developing criteria for how do you recognize a Chaco-related site, and at some point we recognized that real close connection between the Chacoan outliers and the Chacoan roads, and recognized a number of additional sites, some newly discovered, other sites that have been known for some time that we just recognized their affiliation with Chaco Canyon. So yeah, my view of Chaco is really, it's different than a lot of people in that I know a whole lot less about the canyon proper, but probably more about outlying sites than many other archaeologists. The research related to the Chaco Roads was funded by the Bureau of Land Management. So I was able to do that on government time and with government resources. We made a series of really early morning flights where we'd charter an airplane and be at the airport right at sunrise and try to be out over the target area maybe a half hour after sunup when the shadows were long and these really subtle swales that are the Chaco roads were most visible. Took a lot of photography during those flights and it was a real exciting time. My interest in the Pueblo III period sort of grew out of this work with Chaco, that after the Chacoan regional system no longer functioned the way it once had, the distribution of archaeological sites changed a lot in the San Juan Basin, and the character of the record became a lot different. And at about the time that we finished the Chacoan work, the BLM went through a series of reorganizations. And one of the things that happened was that first Farmington and later Taos split off from the Albuquerque field office or the Albuquerque district. So the area that I was responsible for shrank as a part of that. Yeah, my interest in the Pueblo III period sort of grew out of the work with the Chacoan outliers and with the Chacoan roads. There's an area southeast of Chaco Canyon called Chaco Mesa, where we were aware there were a lot of unrecorded archaeological sites there that were on public land. Gwen Vivian had done his master's thesis in that area. The BLM also had a responsibility to Section 110 compliance, to identify sites that were on public land that maybe were not immediately threatened by any proposed activity. And we were able sometimes to spend a little bit of time on that aspect of our work. So one thing that I did with LuAnn Jacobson was to go, we'd spend maybe a week at a time, maybe one week in the course of a summer. We'd go camp on Chaco Mesa and record these archaeological sites. They were from the Pueblo III period, post-Chacoan, and yet there was at least one really clear prehistoric road and a number of other really interesting sites up in that area. So we did a lot of just basic site recording up there, ceramic tallies, tried to learn the pottery for that time period. And eventually LuAnn worked up a National Register nomination for that. The other thing that came out of that was Kathy Cameron invited me to do an article for an issue of Journal of Archaeological Research that she was editing. And then I was also invited to participate in a symposium at Crow Canyon that Mike Adler eventually ended up working up the volume, the final volume on that. Again, that sort of furthered the academic side of my career. And again, I was able to do all of that. The Bureau of Land Management allowed me to do that, and I think a part of it was cultivating an image of the Bureau of Land Management. They were recognizing that cultural resources were making an important part of their agency mission, and wanted to put more emphasis on that. So I felt I got good support from them. Yes, so working in Albuquerque, I had some exposure to proto-historic Navajo archaeology, and I'd always been really interested in the Apache history grew up in southern New Mexico and was exposed to that pretty early, and that was always pretty interesting to me. And also as a child, we had traveled occasionally to Mexico, and I'd always really enjoyed those trips. Sometime probably in the late 1980s, I began to spend quite a bit of my annual leave making trips to Mexico and going into the Sierra Madre. We were just trying to become familiar with the area that the Apache had used in that area, and was also interested in the Casas Grandes system, in part because that there are also prehistoric roads associated with the Casas Grandes system. So several different interests drew me to northern Mexico. At that time, Jane Kelly sort of reached out to me, and I started to spend quite a bit of time visiting her project. She was doing field work in Chihuahua pretty much every summer, and I'd go down and spend a week or two working just as a volunteer on her projects. So that was all done on my own time. That's sort of how my initial interest in Chihuahua began to develop. One of the things that I was interested in there was the roads that were associated with the Paquime system. And going through the old literature, there were sites that De Peso had described as atalayas, and at least some of the roads seemed to be associated with those. And that seemed to me like something that was analogous to what had happened with the prehistoric roads. My thought was that the atalayas may have been shrines instead of or in addition to being hilltop signaling stations, and that the prehistoric roads perhaps were associated with these hilltop, we'd call them traditional cultural properties today. So going through the old literature, there were several locations that were identified as atalayas that I was interested in visiting to see if there were roads associated with them. And it was on one of those trips that I went to what we later found out was Cerro Juanacaña. It was identified on a map that De Peso published, a regional map, as an atalaya. And I went up there one day by myself. There was a little ejido at the base of the hill, and I talked to the people there, and they said it'd be fine to go up there. I told them what I was looking for, and they said, well, there's nothing up there, but you're welcome to go look. And, so I climbed, I climbed up the hill, and when I got to the top, boy, there were these massive rubble walls. And at first I thought that they might be something geological, like maybe dikes or something like that. But, as I walked around, it was clear that they were cultural constructions. And so I started looking around for the pottery to see how old they might be, and I wasn't finding any pottery at all. And boy, it was just really intriguing, and the scale of the site was just mind blowing. And so anyway, that's how my interest in Cerros de Trincheras began. So I started just doing a tape and compass map of Cerro Juanacaña, and realized pretty early on that it sure fit the description of what were described as Cerros de Trincheras. And so, I began to become much more interested in those sites. And at some point, probably at an SAA meeting, I talked to Randy McGuire about that. He and Elisa Villalpando were working at the site of Las Trincheras in Sonora, and they invited me to come and visit them there, which I did, and told Randy about what we were finding, and he's reciprocated and gave me some pointers on it. Anyway, so I made a map, a tape and compass map of Cerro Juanacaña, and began to identify some other Cerros de Trincheras in that area. Cerro Los Torres was another one that was identified back in the late 19th or early 20th century by Blackiston. We visited that one. Some other colleagues in New Mexico told me about Canador Peak, and wrote a little short article for the Archaeological Society of New Mexico publication about that. And I began to give talks about what I was finding, suggesting that these sites began in the late Archaic period. And most people would kind of scratch their heads when I finished those papers. But Eventually, Robert Hart at the University of Texas at San Antonio heard one of those papers, or several of them, and he approached me about doing a project there, which is what I'd just been trying to think of how we could get how to get something like that going, and I pretty much jumped at his offer, and we began a collaboration in that way that's lasted for many years now. When I began mapping at Cerro Canyon, that work was done under the auspices of the research that Paul Minnis and Mike Whalen were doing at the time in that same area. And they took an early interest in what I was finding and encouraged me gave me permission to work as part of their project for that. So we did initial surface investigation and documented a number of late archaic projectile points in that way. Then Bob Hart and I applied for a National Science Foundation high risk program and got a fairly modest grant to do some initial excavation there. So we did several, I'd call them test pits. They were units that were normally 2 adjacent 1 meter by 1 meter units, excavating into these constructed terrace deposits. And it's a really difficult context because there's very little soil. Most of what you're excavating are cobbles, and at that time there hadn't been a lot of excavation done in that sort of context. And the other critical thing is that AMS dating was just coming into general use. So one impediment to research into the archaic earlier had always been that you needed a fairly large piece of charcoal to do any kind of dating. And with AMS dating, of course, we were able to work with much smaller samples. So that technological advance played a key role, I think, in the research there at Cerro Canyon. So we brought a small crew down and did a season's work and excavated several units in Cerro Canyon. And sure enough, we're able, with help from Karen Adams in terms of the flotation, we were able to recover some small pieces of charcoal, and some of them actually did turn out to be maize. So we were able to get, I think, 2 or 3 initial dates from that initial field season, and they confirmed what the surface archaeology was telling us, that the primary occupation there dated to the late archaic period. But before that, everything had indicated that Cerros de Trincheras throughout the Southwest were a phenomenon of late prehistory. So that was just a real surprise. So we wrote a short article and submitted it to Science, and by golly, they published it. So after the Science article, we applied for several larger grants from the National Science Foundation and also from National Geographic, and did, I think 5 seasons total of work at Cerro Canyon. And really it was a whole series of surprises. In the first place, nobody really expected that there'd be anything remotely like that in the late archaic period. But what we were finding in northern Chihuahua fit really well with projects that were going on in the Tucson Basin at about the same time, where they were undertaking large-scale excavations and finding remains there that just didn't accord with our perceptions of the late archaic period and what we now know as the early agricultural period. So, and I think we were fortunate there in that those 2 separate places really were telling the same story and made the profession much more receptive to ideas that we were advancing. Other big surprises was the amount of corn. We eventually realized that we could recover corn pretty routinely from the features there, and we were also able to work at several other sites in the same part of northern Chihuahua and find similar similar sites with almost identical dates, which was another really big surprise. The other big surprise is that the major occupation at Chaco Canyon seemed to be from a really brief time period, and that has a lot of really interesting implications. We continued that work for, like I say, about 5 years, and that was all done pretty much using annual leave to do the field work. At that time, the Bureau of Land Management had gone through some pretty major reorganization, and both the Farmington and Taos offices had split off from Albuquerque, so that the area that I was responsible for in Albuquerque was a whole lot smaller, and there was really less to do there. They had staffs that had been built for a larger area of responsibility, basically, and I don't think they quite knew what to do with us. But part of that is that I was allowed quite a bit of freedom in terms of what I did, and so I was able to do a fair amount of the write-up I was able to do on BLM time, and I always tried to make sure that reflected well on the Bureau of Land Management, and I think that's the value that the agency saw in the work as well. And we also had several collaborative projects with archaeologists in Mexico at that time. So. In terms of continuing the research, Bob and I shifted our area of interest further south. The thought was that these developments at Chaco Canyon and other Cerros de Trincheras seemed to appear really suddenly in the archaeological record. And one obvious possibility is that they were a result of migration of farmers northward. And so we learned about other Cerros de Trincheras further south in Chihuahua, and one obvious possibility is that there was a chain of migration northward. So we spent about 5 years working further south in Chihuahua, and also collaborating some with Jane Kelly in that, looking for other sites that might have been predecessors to the ones that we were finding and had documented. Ultimately, that didn't seem to be the case. We found other Cerros de Trincheras and were able to date them, but they were always later in time. As we worked in northern Chihuahua, we were always aware of the activity of the drug cartels around us. We had ways we tried to be really open about what we were doing and make sure everyone knew who we were, what we were doing, where we were going to be. If anyone suggested we shouldn't go somewhere, we never asked anything. We just didn't do it. And the situation was stable, and we were reasonably comfortable working there. But by around 2010, that had all pretty much changed. The cartels were at war with one another, and things seemed a lot more stable. It started to feel more dangerous to us doing field work in remote areas of rural Chihuahua at that time. With permission from the National Science Foundation, the last year of our funding, we shifted back across the border into southern New Mexico. Chris Turnbow and Tom Holcomb had both mentioned a really interesting archaic site in the Bootheel area of New Mexico. So we used our last year of funding to begin excavation or investigations at a site near Cabin Wells in the New Mexico Bootheel. It was another late archaic site based on the projectile points and looked like just a really, really large midden that was the kind of thing that I guess people had been aware of, but no one had really focused much attention on that. So we did several years of research on that site. I think we'll have some interesting results out of that. And while working there then, people from Archaeology Southwest drew our attention to another Cerro de Trincheras, a new Cerro de Trincheras that had been located using Google Earth up near Duncan, Arizona. And went and looked at that one, and sure enough, there was no pottery on it. We found several indications that it might also date to the early agricultural period, and so we began to work at that site as well. And sort of through that process, our research shifted from northern Mexico back into the United States, but following along similar lines. So over the years, Bob's continued to get grants, and I basically tagged along as a volunteer on the research projects, and we're continuing that today. And also I still really enjoy getting out in the field, doing field work, reading about archaeology, and I'm able to use those in some of the paid work for my consulting. Yeah, another aspect of my career with BLM that was really interesting and rewarding has been the consultations with the different Native American tribes. At some point, the BLM began to put more emphasis on that, and I don't know if it was the best way to do it, but the BLM in general, those responsibilities were assigned to archaeologists. So, I became the main person responsible for sending letters to the tribes and interacting with the tribes over issues related to traditional cultural properties. And that was a lot like the initial phases of being involved in archaeology in the Bureau of Land Management. And that initially at first there was a lot of resistance to the idea within the agencies. I think some managers were really receptive and accepting that was a legal responsibility that we were obligated to honor. But not all managers felt that way. So it was pretty interesting trying to convey the importance of those consultations and the fact that they needed to be government to government, and that the consultations needed to be undertaken in good faith. And also trying to develop a relationship with the tribes, because for many reasons the tribes are very suspicious of the federal government in general and agencies in particular. So that was another challenging but also really rewarding part of the work that I did with BLM. Okay, I think I mentioned when I first moved from Winnemucca, Nevada to Albuquerque, that was a time of kind of major change in archaeological thinking about Chaco Canyon. It was a real creative time, and I knew very, very little about Chacoan archaeology at that point. Two individuals that I was really fortunate to be able to work with in the field a lot were John Stein and Mike Marshall. And they had both been just really instrumental in this recognition that Chaco was more than just a single place out in the San Juan Basin, that it was the center of a much larger regional phenomenon of some sort. And I just learned an awful lot from being able to work in the field with both of them. So I became eligible for retirement in 2006, and really I was becoming a lot more interested in these projects that I was doing with Bob Hart, and so I went ahead and decided to go ahead and accept retirement at that point in my career. And so after 2006, I retired in 2006, and began to sort of split my time between this work with Bob on one hand, and then I also began doing consulting here in Albuquerque, just kind of as one of the mom and pop operations. My wife Rudy would often help me on survey projects and different aspects. So that was kind of one of the major inflection points in my career. Since I've retired, the last several years especially, a major focus of my activity has been completing a book about the work that we did at Chaco Canyon. That Bob and I both been working on this, golly, for almost 20 years now. And just within the last year, we've completed the manuscript and gotten through the copy edit phase, and it looks like that book's finally going to come out here at the end of the year. So we're both really excited about that.